First, what are the main barriers and challenges for people with disabilities in accessing travel and transportation services? And how can we raise awareness about them and address them?
From the experience that I've had very recently, myself and the chief of accessibility at MTA walked for 2 hours on 42nd Street down Grand Central underneath to a new station in Madison. And we went through every single escalator and pretty much every single elevator and pretty much went down from 42nd to 48th. It's a giant tunnel underneath that's just been opened up. And it's been designed 30 years ago. So no accessibility has really been put in place, meaning like tactile ground to kind of let you know to follow routes and so on. None of these have been implemented. So what we are doing now with them is to provide haptic navigation so people that are visually impaired can use the technology to find ticket booths and to get to stations very easily.
At Uber, accessibility means how the app is designed and the experience that our users have. And just to touch on the mobility piece, when I think of the barriers that one might experience on that end could be something like access to wheelchair accessible vehicles, whereby the main barriers there is the cost. They are very expensive, and also availability. So when you're looking at serving people en masse, you need to have enough of the cars, enough of the trained drivers, so that it's actually a viable product. And then the second bit would be just access to wheelchairs which are autonomous and motorized, which would allow one to move from home to the community at ease. So those will be some of the things that I see as some barriers on the mobility end.
When I think about the barriers, I think about the 1.5 billion person living disability in the world. And every time we wake up in the morning, that's where our journey starts on. Like when I'm moving from one destination to another, something always comes into our mind is like, okay, how am I going to move? And what always comes into our mind is being singled out. And we've seen this across Africa, in Europe. As you're flying, you're singled out. You go to the plane and they tell you, oh, you are the wheelchair user. They give you wheelchair which are not accessible for you, and they put you somewhere for hours and they tell you, oh, we shall wait, we shall come and pick you. For me, those are some of the barriers. The attitude, the feeling of like, oh, I'm like a sick person. I cannot feel like I can enjoy the life of traveling from one area to another. Personally, I drive, but then still like, despite I'm driving and I'm using hand controllers in my country where we have a lot of traffic, you find like by the time you reach from one destination to another, your legs are paralyzed, you have pain. And for us, those are some of the challenges, those are some of the barriers.
The main challenge that is there at the airport usually is the infrastructure and design. An aircraft bridge, because for you to board an aircraft, you need to go some steps. Most of them are about 4 meters high. So you can imagine you have to go up 4 meters, and the design of the air bridge does not have somewhere they can actually have a wheelchair move smoothly. So that's a first challenge. Same to the aircraft design. The aircraft design, you'll find, if it's a small aircraft, the space in between, called the aisle. The aisle is so small sometimes to allow a certain size of a wheelchair to pass through. So that means you have to leave your wheelchair at the door, and then you are put on a small wheelchair, which is smaller, that will fit into the aircraft aisle to allow you to sit, to go to access to your seat. And lastly, you find other than the design of those is about the awareness of the airport stakeholders. Do people know how to handle persons with disabilities? Do people appreciate what sort of care they need to be given?
We know that people with disabilities are constantly innovating the world. We're remaking the world all of the time, every day, because it wasn't built for us. And so people with disabilities, I think, often have the most innovative solutions. And so I think when we partner with companies, when we partner with the people who control our built environments, we can really get to innovation. And so I think that gets to the next question of examples of innovations that you've seen, that you've built, that you've experienced, that you want to drive, that can really fill that gap between a person with a disability and their environment.
There are a few technological solutions that we've put in place other than policy. Training is one of the examples of the areas that we've done to enable people to be aware of the needs of people with disability. And just to step back, we look at disability from an airline industry point of view as either a passenger or a guest who is either deaf, who is blind, has got challenges with mobility, and even there's intellectual disability, autism, for example. So a normal person that cannot be able to sit in a particular circle of people, or maybe just some phobia for something. It's a disability, it's actually a great disability, whereby you find. So from a technology point of view, what is it that we are doing to ensure that this person who is either deaf, who is blind, who is unable to move, one is we've seen a new technology of wheelchairs, a wheelchair that can actually drive itself all the way along the ramp to the aircraft. Few of them I've seen at the airport, but I think from a technology point of view, they're coming up in the market that you're able to get a wheelchair that's able to lift you on your own all the way to a higher level, a level of 4 meters and so on, or the size of an aircraft.
This is a spoon that everyone at one point uses. And at this point, even a baby, we've all gone through that stage of being a baby or having a baby at one point, and the baby who cannot feed him or herself, they use a spoon. And for me, when you talk about design and innovations on person living disabilities, it has to start from the baby stage, and it has to start with a spoon of how do we ensure that all the designs, and we need to come to this point of like, how can we get to these baby steps of understanding how to develop different innovations from different spaces, starting from the visual impaired, and then the hearing impairment, the physical, the autism, and then trying to see how do we support these people to ensure that they are living an inclusive environment.
It's about thinking about how we utilize this piece of technology as a technology company to be more innovative. How do we innovate beyond having a piece of technology that enables greater access and greater mobility? And how do we make sure that the fact that that piece of technology can adapt a bit better to each individual rider and each individual driver on the platform, and the drivers earning on the platform require support and assistance and enablement just as much. And I think 2 points to touch on that Victor has made that really are important for us. The first is not being singled out, is there are points at which the Uber Assist product, which is currently we're looking at reintroducing in a number of markets, is the best way of ensuring support for persons with disabilities. But we also need to understand where we can best ensure that the product and the experience is at all times fit for all people who need to access the app, and to ensure that we engage with those with persons living with disabilities to understand how we can ensure that. And then the second is the low-hanging fruit. It's the simple solutions. It's being able to have features that communicate very simple, very easy pieces of information that just create a more inclusive environment for all riders and for all drivers. And I think by bringing both of those together, we can ensure that the core technology that is enabled greater mobility can do so best for persons with disabilities.
Yeah, and just to build on what you've just said in terms of the simplicity. So our core features are prioritized for cognitive functionality. So this is not just to benefit thousands of us with cognitive disabilities, but the world is a very confusing place and overwhelming. And we designed these features to reduce distraction, to make it more predictable so that someone can feel safe. And because we look at accessibility as a cross-dimensional aspect, we also incorporate features like safety, which is a big priority on our platform. So when you're looking at safety, we are talking of things like the ability to share your ride with your friends or with your family, so that someone knows at any point where you are. And then we're also talking about things like women preferred rider. And when we're also looking at safety, you're looking at things like panic buttons on our platform, where if you're on an Uber ride from here to town or wherever, if something was to happen and you press that panic button, the team in the back end is going to determine what kind of help you need. If it's medical help that you need, an ambulance will be dispatched to you. If it's security backup that you need, a police dispatch will be sent to you. So we are looking at these more broadly and just looking at the simpler things of how to make one feel safe no matter their situation.
We have created a way to really implement haptics to be outputted directly to your smartphones. And I'm just going to kind of have you have an imagination of what I'm talking about. So if you hold a phone in front of you, it will vibrate very strong if you're in the wrong direction. And as you deviate towards the right direction, the vibration will get weaker and weaker, and it will stop eventually, and will tap, give you a little heartbeat when you face the right direction. So this is what I mean when I say haptic navigation. So with that said, now everybody with a smartphone has access to this haptic navigation technology, which is kind of like how valuable a compass was maybe to a sailor, that could be now implemented to a blind person getting around town.
What role does technology play in transportation? What role do you see it playing? And then how does it get to that piece of personalization or privacy, or the need to identify yourself or be identified by your environment in order to use the technology?
If you can imagine with me for a second, year 2030, and a lot of vehicles are autonomous. Even when I go to SF, there's Cruise and there's Waymo with plenty of, fully autonomous vehicles rolling around. And now Uber coming into play in partnership with Waymo, this is going to really blow up. So if you can imagine a world with that, and you are a person with, let's say, low vision in the night, in a, let's say, kind of a dangerous location, looking for an autonomous vehicle arriving somewhere, and there's nobody to call. It's going to be a little bit awkward, I think. And especially as a person is trying to find the vehicle and maybe going to another vehicle, which still happens today, that may even happen more. So I think to this question really is like, how do we make something that's accessible, truly adaptable, and what is like kind of that looking like for the future? And just talking about autonomous vehicles specifically, I think is a key component because of that specific thing that we're creating for the future that is going to create that challenge for the users. So inclusivity and accessibility should be really looked upon by these new technology that's emerging, and how that can be safer fully by everybody. So this is where we want to really adapt the haptic navigation onto this. Of course, we've tested this out with Waymo teams. And again, very excited for the partnership with Uber because the scalability is a big component to it.
We've ensured that our app is compatible with dozens of software add-ons which exist there, and something like haptic navigation, for example. So just having that ability to include all these add-ons which make life a little bit easier. And yeah, if you're talking about some things like having a screen reader, which will allow someone who is either blind or just visually impaired to be able to read something which is displayed on the screen, and just making sure that our app can allow you to add on any feature which is going to be specifically useful for you, could be one of the ways that technology helps make life a little bit easier.
Technology can do everything. And I've seen that almost on a daily basis. Apart from the personal touch, that's the only thing technology can't do. However, I want to bring to your attention, when we talk about the technology, in this room, we all can maybe afford a smartphone, definitely. But I want to bring to your attention, what about our colleagues in the Maasai land at this time? How can we support them to access the technology we're talking about, or even cannot understand, and they are definitely singled out?
Just to change the discussion a bit into the context for aviation. Aviation is highly regulated, and any single change you want to make has to go through a chain of processes. From a technology point of view, how we can use technology. One, at the time of booking for a service, be it a flight, be it a service at the airport, technology is enabled to ensure that either you select a service, and in the service that you are selecting, you also indicate your inability. So I know from the word go that yes, I'll be booking a flight. Then on this flight, I'm not able to, I'm challenged visually, and therefore I need somebody to support, or can be supported all the way. And of course, the technology has to happen. However, there's a human intervention that comes in. Somebody has to support to enable you to do that. The airport experience, what is it that we do and can be done to make the experience better? I'm looking at the audio-visual signs. That can we have signs that actually, if I'm not able to speak, if I cannot hear the announcements, then I can see the signs. And lastly, the onboard experience. So I'm already on board. Do I know if I'm visually impaired, what food am I being served? At the time of selecting the meal, at the time of maybe checking the flight, it allows me to select my seat so that you sit at a seat that you are more comfortable, so that you be given preference to either get on board or disembark at your destination.
So we've been talking a lot about the individual experience between the person and tech, and I want to talk about collaboration now. So with disability rights organizations and governance entities in driving equity for people with disabilities in transportation, how can we better collaborate? Are there policies and regulations that we need? And before you pass the mic, just a final thought about if you were to drive one education campaign to increase access for people with disabilities in transportation, what would it be focused on? John, we'll start with you.
In terms of collaboration, there are a couple of areas that we can collaborate. As Kenya Airways, we've been able to transport persons with disabilities on various events. I remember the latest one being last month, where we were able to support the national team of Gabon, who are disabled, and they had games in Zambia. It was a big team, I think in 20s, and we're able to do this. We've also been able to support the Kenyan Olympic team into South Africa, into other parts of the world in the past. So collaboration avenues are there, either in sporting. The other collaboration avenues will be in terms of getting somebody with a disability to speak to the users of the airport so that they actually understand what you want, how best you can be handled. This is also one of the forums that I sitting here and listening and seeing this firsthand. I'm in charge of airports that we fly to, 42 of them. So I know exactly what we require to do in Mozambique, for example, or in China or in UK. So that awareness, that session that we have, that knowledge transfer, that understanding of the challenges that you go through, to be a very good initiative. What I can drive personally, especially the engagement, is to create those forums, to create those sessions that we actually can sit together, can share that information, can build and challenge one another, and more importantly, come up with solutions that will enable the experience of persons with disability to feel better when using the air transport.
When I think about the policies and the collaboration, it has to start from this room we are talking about. Talking about the government, we're having the government officers here and who are into the policy making. But then after the policy making, so what? You feel like we are having a lot of policies in place, but they are not implemented. And the reason why, when talk about the transportation, mostly the transport business owned by the private entities. So you find, especially in Africa, so you find like, despite we're trying to get the basics of having easy access to transportation, it becomes hard. The collaboration had to start from how can we come in as the East African community and have a joint policy that I can move from Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Congo, and Sudan with just the same policy. I can be independent other moving across the East African, starting from the East African context.
Most of, I guess, what I focus on is engagements with government and policy and regulators. And at the end of the day, transport is multimodal. Uber plays a small or a big role in that, dependent on the transport route. But the entire route needs to be accessible, and that's something that is really important, is engaging to ensure that there should be seamless movement between transportation options so that the full range of transportation services are available, and that mobility can therefore really be expanded and can really take on that challenge of utilizing, in some cases, just the last mile to ensure that there's integration within those transport systems. And thinking about the interaction between those is an area where collaboration is incredibly important, and really something that any development going forward really does need to do. And then finally, and I think potentially more introspectively, is thinking about what Brianna said about what's the education campaign, and I think it's about non-visible disabilities. I think there's a lot of thought that goes into solving for visible disabilities, but at the same time, educating and utilizing the reach of technological platforms to educate and just create a more inclusive and more accessible environment for persons without visible disabilities is also something that is very important and an opportunity and something to embrace going forward.
What I can close with is we are trying, but we still have a long way to go. We still need to work together as a community, as policymakers, as government, to come up with solutions which are practical, simple, like you said, going back to the basics. So there is a lot of room to be more accessible, but all that has been discussed here is very systemic. It's very hard for a particular company in the private sector or in the whichever sector it's in. It has to be a collaborative effort across multiple stakeholders because of all the issues that are involved, from cost to availability to everything that the policymakers can, like the policies they can put in place that are going to ensure that we are living in a more accessible society.
From my experience as a tech company or as a tech startup, I would say, right, you have an opportunity to position yourself, kind of in between government regulations and so on and the big tech companies. And I think what people may see as a need, big tech companies may see it as a liability, which means cost. So that's kind of the big struggle of the whole game. And I think if we provide a cost-effective solution that solves the majority of the problem, then big tech companies wouldn't really say no to that, right? That seems logical. So, and with the regulators and the legislation and the, Congress and so on, we have been working in some sector with the Duckworth office, trying to push things. And what they have been telling us is, don't mention this kind of stuff to the tech companies because they're going to try to shut it down. So that's why it's really amazing to be here, sponsored by Microsoft, Google, and, doing this hosted by Uber and stuff, because I think there is a big priority change potentially happening, or maybe it's just a look, but I think nonetheless it's happening. So I think we should kind of ride that wave. And if people are working in tech startups, or in privileged position to help, I think this is a great time to do it, because change is being made. And as soon as these laws change, I always make an example like LEDs. I used to work in lighting. So as soon as architecture companies knew that LEDs were going to take over and everybody needs to now change, construction companies and design all had to put LEDs. That changed the game. It literally made a law that had to be put in place to save energy for the long-term future. So I think it's the same thing for accessibility. It needs to be a foundation that's a bit stronger. And I think the government is a bit shaky on doing a lot of this, and the big tech companies are suppressing some of these from going through, I think, until potentially now. So, a little push goes a long way here. And I think once these big rules do come into place, it could change the game for the long haul. So, I'm hopeful for this future. And again, just making it easy as possible and cheap as possible to implement for the mass majority without having the connotation of being an accessibility tool, I think is the dual kind of middle ground, perhaps, between the people's desires and the tech companies' desires. So kind of like hitting a sweet spot, I think, is a key.